Hello, welcome to my basement. I am Pastor Bill Hennessy. I'm the pastor at North Presbyterian Church in Williamsville, New York. And this is a Bible study that I've been providing during this time of quarantine in the pandemic, each day using the daily lectionary readings. Those are found at the PCUSA website, pcusa.org. And you can search for daily lectionary readings and find the material that I use. And today we are continuing with the reading from the Gospel of Matthew. This is still part of the Sermon on the Mount, which is an extended section in Matthew's Gospel where Jesus is giving a set of teachings, sort of just one right after the other. They aren't necessarily even particularly related to one another. They're sort of disjointed in some ways, but each section sort of covers, I guess, just a wide range of concerns and questions. It began, of course, with the Beatitudes. And those are sort of setting up the framework, I think, for Jesus' teaching, which is this sort of reversal of status for people, giving honor to those who society generally considers to be dishonored. And so it's a way of sort of rethinking how we regard others and how we look at our own sort of status and our place in society. So this then moves on to look to sort of examine Torah. So using statements from Torah, you have heard it said thus, but I say this, and it is sort of a sort of rethinking of the interpretation of Torah. So this is where we are now, and we're looking at the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verses 27 through 37. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. It was also said, "Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce." But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of unchastity causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, "You shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows you have made to the Lord." But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. So, excuse me, those are kind of extreme statements, right? And if we look at them just one at a time, I think the first one, this idea of adultery as not just an active betrayal of fidelity, but to even lust after someone, again, Jesus is talking about motive and getting at sort of inner, your inner life, and there is, I think there is some value to this idea that it's possible to be emotionally involved with someone even though you're not physically involved with them. And that can lead to some very difficult situations in a marriage. But it's a matter of, what's happening in your heart, where your real sort of commitment is. And Jesus is telling folks that they can't take their relationships lightly, or treat them as disposable, but that we need to be fully committed in those relationships. He then goes on to use these hyperbolic statements, which one hopes no one would ever take literally. The reality is, of course, your eye or your arm, your hand, they don't cause you to do anything. You use these things. We all use them for various things, but they don't cause a person to do anything. I think the point that Jesus is making, I hope, is we need to give our whole lives over to behaving in ways that have integrity, and that requires all of us, and to sort of be compartmentalized in how we look at the world, as often we find, for instance, among politicians who can, on the one hand, make claims around certain areas of ethics, and yet violate them in other places. How they can reconcile those things. We all are able to do that. We can sort of hold others to standards that we won't apply to ourselves. I think this is what Jesus is getting at, is how we engage our whole being in ethical behavior, and how do we live lives of integrity. So he uses this hyperbolic language as a way of getting folks, I think, to think more deeply about their sort of whole life commitment to living in a way that is reflective of God's presence and God's love. So clearly he's not speaking literally in that passage, but using that method of hyperbole to make that point. And it's an important point to make, especially today, in a world that does allow us to sort of be fractured in our living. We are able to behave in one way in one setting and in an entirely different way in another. When are we ever fully ourselves? And Jesus is saying we must always strive to be fully human, fully who we are in every situation, and bring to every situation the same integrity and ethical choices that we would make, at home and business, in church, whatever it is, that our public life should be a reflection of our private life, and and we shouldn't sort of make a distinction between these things that allows us to engage in unethical behavior in one place that we would never consider appropriate in another. So that kind of integrity, I think, is what Jesus is getting at in that passage. Then he goes on to talk about divorce. Now, divorce occurs or is mentioned in Mark's gospel. In Mark's gospel, it's brought up in a different way. Some teachers come to him, some scribes. I'm not sure if they're lawyers, maybe, come to him saying, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? And that Moses says that all they have to do is, write a certificate of divorce. So that's mentioned here, the certificate letter. And I'm convinced that question to Jesus in Mark's gospel brought by these teachers, these elders, whatever they are, is a reflection of a reality in that culture that was sort of inescapable. That is that divorce, because it was entirely the man's prerogative and allowed a man to sort of essentially dismiss his wife, creates tremendous hardship for the woman. Because in that culture, a woman who is divorced by her husband has zero rights and has no protection. So it's essentially a death sentence. And I think that these teachers who come to Jesus with this question, which may or may not have been sort of an authentic, genuine sort of question, but I think they're certainly aware of the inconsistency that exists there, and the real problem that a society has when a man is given that kind of power over a woman and can sort of wield it arbitrarily. And Jesus, in Mark's gospel, answers that question a little differently than here, but it's the same thing. He says it's not you can't just eliminate a marriage like that, and it's you're causing, if you remarry, then you're causing someone to commit adultery. In the modern world, this standard is really impossible to keep in a society that has still, I think, 50% divorce rate. How can we possibly expect people to live up to that kind of a standard? But we also live in a world where women have rights and have recourse, and there is, even though by and large when a divorce occurs, it favors the man over the woman, and certainly the standard of living that a man has increases, goes up, and the standard of living that the woman has, especially if she's has custody of children, goes down. And that is really a tragic sort of dimension of our system. But women do have rights, and it's not entirely the man's prerogative whether a divorce occurs. Women can file for divorce just as men can. And so we can't really apply, I think, this standard to the modern world. It just makes no sense at all. And when we try, we end up doing all kinds of mental gymnastics to make it appropriate or legitimate, like annulling a marriage of decades long as if it were never a marriage to begin with. What does that say about the children who were born in that marriage? It's just a ridiculous thing to try and do. I think when it comes to a passage like that, we need to recognize the context in which Jesus is speaking and the world where he was teaching and the people around him are living, and realize that we are at a different place socially. I think it's always problematic to to go to Scripture for sort of specific advice on social relationships, because the world of the Bible is an ancient world that is steeped deeply in patriarchy, and holds assumptions about human relationships that we no longer accept, and to use the standards of an ancient world for our modern world, as far as like specific descriptive standards, I think makes no sense at all. I think there are certainly I guess we should think and note that when it comes to social relationships in Scripture, we should be thinking in terms of what is sort of the underlying hope for those relationships. And even though in practice you had this deep patriarchy, there is, even in Scripture, the value that women and men live in a partnership and not in a hierarchy. If you look at the creation story, for instance, if you have to go all the way back to that, it's clear that in the garden, man and woman are created together as partners, not in a hierarchical way, and it's actually then part of the curse that the man will lord it over the woman. So that hierarchy, that patriarchy that goes on is unintended. It is not what was intended in creation. And yet we've taken that to be sort of the assumption or the norm, instead of an aberration of the relationships that are intended for men and women. That's what underlies Scripture, I think. And we are always being called to practice that original intention in our relationships, and not just give in to this sort of social patriarchy that we all kind of live in by default. That's I think how we need to be looking at those social relationships. When I've talked about divorce over the years, for instance, in sermons, and it's not very often because it is such a complex and touchy subject, but one thing I've tried to make clear is I've done a lot of weddings over the years, and I've never ever married a couple who went into their wedding intending to be divorced. People don't enter these relationships with the intention of them ending in animosity and in pain. Divorce is it's a sad and often just sort of unavoidable end to a relationship. But it's never, I think, what anyone intends. And the church should acknowledge that and be compassionate toward folks instead of condemning or judgmental. That, I think, only adds to the pain, which I think makes no sense at all. In this context, in the context of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is saying, I think, a man does not sort of alleviate himself of responsibility simply by divorcing his wife, simply by dismissing her. He still has a responsibility in a world where that divorce is, like I say, a death sentence practically. So I think, one way to interpret that isn't just sort of rigid blanket claim about divorce in the abstract. It's more, I think, talking about what happens to the two parties when that occurs, and one of them is hurt much more deeply than the other. The last portion, swearing, again, it has to do with integrity and has to do with, I think, our own sort of sense of commitment. Let your no be no, your yes be yes. Stand on your word and don't try to invoke the heavens or to drag God into those commitments in terms of your own integrity. Be your own person. When you do, it seems, and he says, it comes from the evil one. I think, when we invoke the heavens or invoke God into our into those claims, I think it's really a way of sort of creating an inviolable, sort of impenetrable fence around ourselves. It's a way of self-promotion and self-protection, and the reality is, when we make a commitment, it's sort of like the idea the buck stops here. We have to take responsibility for those decisions. We can't just shift them to God. If things go wrong because we make a bad decision, we need to own up to that, and not just throw up our hands and say we have no responsibility. That's right now certainly an important concern, because we are living in a period when responsibility for results of action or inaction seems to be sort of floating around in terms of our political leadership. We need people of integrity to be sort of in charge in this country, and when we don't have them, it really creates situations that are intolerable. So I think that's what that portion of this this passage is addressing, that our need to take responsibility for our actions, and stand on those choices, and own up to them when they fail, when the results of them fail. That's we take that responsibility. So that's how I understand those. They are, I think, just kind of fascinating reinterpretations of what might have been considered sort of common wisdom in that time. And one thing we probably should remember is this is an honor-shame culture. That is, a person's reputation hinged on their being perceived as honorable, which means that often people would go to some great lengths to preserve that, even if it meant being deceptive, in order to protect their honor. So that kind of a culture can drive people to do things that are ethically inappropriate in order to protect themselves, because the shaming part of that was devastating. The reliance that people have on their communities is so deep that if you are cut off because of some dishonorable action, then you're kind of left on your own, and that would have been a very dangerous outcome for anyone. So avoiding that at all costs was certainly a motive. Jesus seems to say, if you live a life of integrity, you shouldn't need to worry about that. That you should be able to live in such a way that everything you do is regarded as honorable, because you take responsibility for your choices and for who you are. So I think this has to do with living with integrity in our relationships, in our choices, in our commitments. So again, maybe not all that groundbreaking, but certainly I think an important set of values for followers of Jesus to internalize. And if you look at the people in your life who have been important for you and have influenced you, they are probably people who had a lot of integrity, people you could rely on, whose word you could trust. And that's sort of the proof of the pudding, in my opinion. The people around us who have the deepest influence on us are people we want to emulate, the kind of people that perhaps Jesus is talking about in this passage. Well, this is Friday. It is May 8th, I believe. And so I will be back on Monday. As it happens, of course, on Sunday is Mother's Day. And this is sort of a neat, connection to that, in that it's those women in our lives who have been people of integrity, who have shaped us, that this passage sort of points us to. So I hope you'll take some time this weekend to think about those women, the women who have been mothers for you, either in your actual life, literally, or figuratively, as have helped to shape you in some important way. Remember those people. If they're still living, try and connect with them. Give them a call. If they are not, then lift them up as in prayers of thanksgiving, because these are the people who have made us who we are. So, friends, have a good weekend. Be safe again, and continue to be well, and look out for one another. And may God's peace walk with you. Until next time.